Hello everyone and welcome to CodeCast by STLTechTalk. We're going to bring you the content you want and need, instructional, informative, unique, and insightful commentary on programming and technology. Coming to you live from robots to roadhouses, my name is JJ Hammond and I'm joined tonight by two coding experts. Up first, he is CTO of Celiance? Am I saying that right? Okay, right on. Microsoft Regional Director, Microsoft MVP, and Pluralsight author. He specializes in building rich HTML and XAML clients and the services that back them with ASP.NET, WCF, and Azure. He is an author of a half a dozen Pluralsight courses, 4 books, and dozens of magazines and online publication articles. The fantastic Brian Noyes. Hello, and thank you for being on the show, Brian.
Thanks for having me, guys.
It is our pleasure, sir. However, this show would not be possible, and I wholeheartedly mean that, without the coolest guy I know, and just all-around awesome, striving to bring development knowledges to the masses, and has spent the last 20 years architecting and implementing highly scalable ASP.NET applications. Our very own Gus Emery. Hello, Gus, and how are you doing tonight, sir?
Doing well, JJ. Brian, thanks for joining us tonight. I very much appreciate you coming on.
Absolutely.
Oh, and by the way, I hate you all for having great time without me at that conference, but, you know, whatever. And don't forget, everyone, you can follow us on Twitter, hashtag CodeCast or STLCodecast. Also, you can find us on Facebook at STLTechTalk, Google+, subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Windows Phone, TuneIn Radio, or listen directly from the site. So that's awesome. So if you want to go to our site right now, which I suggest everybody do that, and then go to this page, you can actually watch it live. Tech news, podcasts, codecast, programming code, hands-on, and event coverage, just a whole bunch of awesome stuff for the site. STLTechTalk.com. Go there right now. And don't forget, you can interact with the show by sending us feedback to podcast@STLTechTalk.com. And if you're watching us live, you can ask us questions via the chat room, and we'll do our best to answer those questions in a timely manner. Special thank yous go out tonight to Steve, our last guest, Rzgalski. He was fantastic, so it was great to have him on. What a great show. It was just really great, so thank you very much. Also, I wanted to take a moment to thank the sponsors of our show, Inertia Software, creating cutting-edge, highly scalable Microsoft technological solutions to the energy industry. Visit www.inertia-software.com to find out how they can help you. So without further ado, let's go ahead and kick the show off to our guest with the first question. What got you into technology and what got you into development, sir?
Well, I kind of came into it late compared to a lot of people my age in this industry. I had a separate career in the Navy first, and was flying jets and got into gaming and kind of became a power user and ended up being the squadron, we called it the ADP, Automated Data Processing Officer, basically the IT guy, which in those days pretty much meant go around and fix the computer after someone deleted AutoExec BAT. And from there it was kind of like, okay, I like these computer thingies, what's the next step, and figured programming was it, and sort of self-taught myself from there.
Awesome. That's pretty cool. Making that transition, I'm sure, wasn't all that difficult, but it's definitely a change of pace, I would think, from just an overall lifestyle change, because you have to be much more physical, obviously. And I'm not saying all of us developers are lazy, but we are a little lazy sometimes, and so I'm sure making that transition was a little different for you.
Yeah, I'm certainly slower and fatter than I was in those days.
I think we're all slower and fatter than we were 10 years ago, believe me.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
definitely.
I need to get one of those treadmill standing desks. So tell us. So what was it like? Just real fast. Because you flew fighter jets. That's awesome. Tell us what that was like. Just that experience of doing that.
Oh, it was a lot of fun. It was interesting looking back on it because the technology was so old, compared to the computer systems we deal with today. The avionics and stuff in the Tomcat, the F-14 that I flew were 1960s technology. But it was a very physical kind of it kept you engaged, because I was a backseater, I was a radar intercept officer, so I was working the radars, doing the navigation, talking on the radios, kind of backing the pilot up on the flight stuff, but we didn't have a stick back there.
Oh.
And we were responsible for the long-range weapons. The pilot was responsible for the short-range ones. So there was a lot of, kind of pushing buttons and using the radar, and it was just very busy most of the time. So the time goes by very fast in the cockpit, and certainly just being up there, flying around and pulling Gs, and especially anytime we got to do air combat maneuvering and dogfighting and that kind of stuff was very cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure it was. I mean, do you still kind of keep up with that? I mean, do you still kind of have your eye on the different technology that's in these things now? I mean, is it so crazy of a chasm of difference?
It's funny. It's like I shut off a part of my brain when I stopped doing that, because I'll have these conversations with Richard Campbell, who I know you've had on the show, and he'll be like, "Dude, have you looked at the latest stuff with the X-35?" And I'll be like, let's see, let me think about that. What is that plane again?
He freaks me out with his knowledge of crap that he knows. Like, he just has, like, he's like one of those, he's just like, it's like he could just pull that stuff out. And you're like,
Yeah.
what did you find that out? And why? Because it has nothing to do with but rock on, So that's interesting. So did you have more mechanical pieces when you were flying? That you knew how to, because that's the thing with me in cars, and I'm sure everybody can kind of relate to this a little bit, is I liked working on the older stuff because you could see that stuff happening, right? And now it's like, everything's basically, almost everything's self-contained or computerized in nature, so it's not the same experience, right? Not the same kind of very visual experience.
Yeah, well, and my my education, my undergrad was aerospace engineering, and then I went and got a graduate degree in it as well. But the graduate degree was more aerospace avionics, so it was kind of bridging into the computer arena, and that kind of took me down my path to where I am today to some degree. But definitely the planes we were flying at the time, it was not push rods and gears and stuff, but it was that F-14 was all hydromechanical, so there was no fly-by-wire at all. When the pilot moved the stick, he was pushing push rods and stuff that eventually got to a hydraulic actuator that pushed fluid through a line to move the surfaces. So the most electronic thing in the plane really were the individual avionics boxes that would turn a dial or something like that, or probably the radar was the most electronically complex. But even that was just sweeping a radar sweep across the screen and putting green blips on a green screen.
So you were born awesome, weren't you? Like, you're one of those. Like, there's no like learning thing where I started whatever. So like, you've just always been naturally gifted. So
I don't know about that.
Right on. I hate you just a little bit for that. But so Gus, you're up.
Yep. So Brian, we're talking about single-page applications today. Can you explain what a single-page application is?
Sure, I can attempt it. You have to have some degree of web development background to really, differentiate it from other things. But I think it's hard for people to understand sometimes, because if you come from a pure web background, you're used to thinking of things in a certain way, rendering pages out from the server side, focusing on server-side coding techniques and platforms, and stuff happens in the browser, but you don't spend all your time focusing on that. Single-page apps kind of turn that on its head and say, no, the server, that just pretty much delivers files at the end of the day. It's almost like we're going back in time to the early days of what web servers were capable of doing, and they just delivered files that, in those days were just static content. Now it's all dynamic application functionality, but it's all running on the client side. So, in simplistic terms, you can think of it as an evolution of Ajax. Over time, we've gone from pure server-rendered stuff that just sat there in the browser and didn't do much, and then we added a little more and a little more and a little more JavaScript, and especially started making, async calls back to the server, and this just kind of takes that to 11, if you will. You crank it up and say, let's just do it all that way, because now the browsers and the JavaScript execution engines are fast enough. The JavaScript tooling has gotten better. the libraries that are out there to support you with complex patterns in JavaScript have come a long way. So you basically flip a bit and say, you know what, let's just build a smart client, but let's do it using web client technologies. And it's going to happen to live in the browser, but at the end of the day, it's really a smart client.
So what kind of technologies are you using to build these then? Or what do you suggest to use anyway?
You know, that's becoming an easier and easier question just based on the, you know, the tides of popularity. If you asked me that 6 to 12 months ago, it would have been a kind of waffly answer of, well, you could use this or you could use this. You know, in the last just 6 months alone, it's gone down to there's one answer, Angular. Angular is kind of the center of the universe. Everyone's flocking to it. It's got, you know, a team working on it at Google. So it's got, you know, unlike a lot of open source JavaScript projects out there that sort of like flourish and then die, or flourish and then wither and die, you know, this one is flourishing, and it's got backing, and it's got the entire community attention. So it sort of feels like you can bet on Angular, and it's not going to disappear underneath you.
Okay. Can you explain what Angular does for you?
Yeah.
Sure. So Angular kind of gives you an end-to-end client-side single-page application framework. And what I mean by that is, like I said, I think of it, you know, I have to say that my background is that I started out in the early .NET days. I was all web. I was all about ASP.NET Web Forms. I was an ASP.NET MVP was when I first got MVP. And then, like, I sort of switched my brain in the mid-2000s when the smart client revolution happened, and kind of jumped on that boat and got into Windows Forms and then WPF and Silverlight. And almost my entire focus for a number of years there, a good 5 years at least, was purely, you know, smart client technologies. And I pretty much ignored ASP.NET 2, you know, the initial release of MVC and so on, and then sort of rejoined the fold after a while. And so, you know, for me, it's very easy to approach single-page applications because basically when, you know, just as people were starting to look at it as a way of building out a web page or a set of web pages that all sort of form an application, and we can talk more about, you know, kind of that vague term I just threw out there. But, you know, when you go and start building things this way, at the end of the day, like I said, you're building a smart client, and you just happen to be using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and a set of JavaScript libraries out there as the way you get that done, as opposed to using the .NET framework and parts of the .NET framework to get it done if you were building smart clients with .NET. So it's very easy for me, especially because I also, in those days, I spent a lot of time focusing on smart client design patterns and separation of concerns, UI separation patterns, like back in the day, you know, MVC, then Model View Presenter, MVP, was popular in the Windows Forms days, and then it became MVVM, Model View View Model, for XAML days. And so, you know, you come full circle, jump back into the single page app space, and those same patterns apply, because the idea is now if we're going to go write all this code, most of it in JavaScript, we can't do what web developers have been doing for ages with JavaScript, which is to start throwing a bunch of functions in a file and hope it all works out.
That's so,
I love it.
that so sounds like me. It really does. That's
that's where you start, JJ. Then you learn to adapt and split your code.
Then you learn to not do that. Because that's a bad idea, folks.
Yeah,
that's
exactly. The pain starts to build, and you say there's got to be a better way to go about this.
Yeah, and then it turns into one of those cliche moments where you're like, and there's got to be a better way, and there is, JJ. You know, it's just like,
well, exactly. And getting back to the question, so, you know, what does Angular do for you? That's part of what it does for you. Is it's what people say a prescriptive framework that doesn't just say, here's a library with some stuff you can call into if you so choose. It more says, here is the way you will structure your application. And it forces you down a path of good separation of concerns, modularity, you know, loose coupling between components, all the things that many people have talked about over the years, especially in the smart client space on the client side. And, you know, some of the same things that ASP.NET MVC was designed to address on the server side when you're rendering everything from the server side. So Angular just brings all that same stuff to the client side and says you can do all your coding on this side, but you can still do it in a good patterns-based way and end up with a good architecture.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, that's what it's all about too, man. It's building that out, knowing where everything's at, and not just like throwing it. Now, real fast, I'm sorry, this isn't in the notes for it, but do you think because Google is a little bit because it's behind more Angular and it has more attention, do you think that's why it's just going to continue to grow?
Honestly, I think the reason it's got the groundswell it does is more just because it's a damn good framework.
Okay.
And people who come to it and,
Sure.
As long as they get over the initial hurdle of, oh my God, it's JavaScript.
Sure.
There's a lot of people that come into, especially, like I said, traditional web developers that have basically said, yeah, I'll do as little JavaScript as I can get away with, just enough to do what I got to do, and yeah, that JavaScript will probably look like hell and take forever to write, and it'll suck. Basically, they have this JavaScript sucks mentality.
Right.
You got to get past that to say, no, actually, JavaScript's awfully powerful,
right.
And you put some good libraries into it, and you put some good patterns around the coding practices that you're using. Yeah, there's still some pain there. I was, trading Skypes with my colleague Michelle Leroux Bustamante today, and she was, working on a project, and she was just cursing JavaScript because she was in one of those, hell situations that's easy to get into, where because it's a dynamic language, you don't have that compile time checking. You get some error that's 20 layers deep down inside Angular. In this case, in her case, it was, I think it was P is undefined. Yeah, the stack trace was like 16 layers deep into Angular.
And it's like finding the path, and like you're,
Exactly.
It's like, okay, all right, I'm a honey badger in this bed. It's just like I'm going in.
Yeah, and in the end, it's a semicolon or something.
Yeah, exactly. Or a curly brace, or yep.
Yep, it's something totally stupid that you don't see, and it takes 3 hours to find that semicolon or something, and you go, "Oh, really? That's it?
Exactly.
Why couldn't you tell me that?"
Yeah, so it's definitely it still feels a little bit Wild West-like compared to, for a hardcore .NET developer that's, lived entirely in the warm blanket of Visual Studio with the, the compiler to back them up.
Yeah.
It does feel a little, especially because you get into, it's a very different arena in terms of, okay, Angular gives you most of what you need, but there's still this kind of cobble it together aspect to doing JavaScript development where it's like, oh, that's what you want to do? You can use this or you can use that, and there's like 20 different libraries that all do the same thing. It's like, all I want to do is format a frickin' date nicely, You really have to do a research project and pros and cons and compare and contrast to figure out how to do that, but to a certain degree you do.
In these days, I think you do. Let me actually embellish onto that topic really quick and ask you, because I was asked this just the other day as well. What do you think of using TypeScript as the JavaScript style to go in and build this stuff? And I'm kind of iffy on that at this point. It's not that I don't like it. It's just that I'm not positive of its output yet. I don't think it's 100% there yet. But I'd like to get your opinion.
Sure. Yeah, I kind of question my own opinion because I went through a project recently with a customer where they said, let's do this in TypeScript. Mm-hmm. And that was my first time, kind of using it in Angular. And initially, when I heard about TypeScript, I was just like, oh my God, yes, that sounds wonderful. That sounds like it'll, cure all the things I hate about JavaScript programming, because I'm a, strongly typed static language kind of guy since the beginning. When I did start programming as a hobby, it was with C++, object-oriented, compiled language all the way. Mm-hmm. And so it sounded awesome to me initially. Mm-hmm. But for me in particular, the first time I went and tried to use it, I had already kind of gotten over that JavaScript bar to where I feel pretty darn competent with JavaScript. And I found myself going, really? I've got to go create an object with properties on it just so I can push some data around? That's like so much work. And I found that, I had kind of gotten into this, like, I'm liberated by the dynamic language aspects of JavaScript at times, especially when dealing with data and pushing around JSON objects and, just getting an object and just tacking a new property on it at the point where I need it and stuff like that. Certainly that can be the cause of a lot of bugs too, so that, that's freedom that can hurt. But I like that freedom now that I'm used to it. And so I find TypeScript to be too constraining for that environment for me.
Good. Actually, your answer was better than mine was. Seriously, the thing that worried me, when you're using Breeze, and actually in the demo that I did was with Knockout, It's a little bit more open. It's not as sealed as Angular is and enforced. But that being said, could you use that to do your view, all your functionality and your view models and all that stuff? Well, of course you can. But the point being is, how much troubleshooting are you going to have after the fact if you actually went that way? And I'm 50-50 on that one.
Yeah, that's the part where I'm not entirely convinced yet. I think I need to be forced again on the little project that I did it on was fairly small. It was more of a proof of concept that they wanted to see what it looked like in TypeScript. So I didn't go down the path of using all the constructs, defining interfaces, being as strongly typed as you can be in TypeScript, which is, and part of it was, like I said, I had this inherent resistance to it, which is weird, because as soon as I jump over the fence and I go write my web APIs, I'm a total Nazi about, interface boundaries and good separation patterns and being really rigorous about, your naming conventions and all that kind of stuff. So you would think that I would be an equal Nazi when I jump over to the, the client side and want to use TypeScript and do all those same things. But I can't explain why, but I seem to have this resistance to it on that side of the fence.
I think it's a dynamic form of HTML that forces that, because we think of the form in an SPA being very manipulative, right? Where we're actually injecting things and binding and changing and using CSS to change the views, even though the views actually exist on the page. And I'm almost wondering if that's why you look at the dynamic language of JavaScript and say, I wonder if that's why, if that makes it. I can't say it for sure, but it's actually an interesting thought.
Yeah, I do think that, if someone's coming into this fairly fresh, they're totally a .NET developer, done everything in C# or VB, and they're just jumping into JavaScript, they're probably going to find TypeScript to be a more pleasant experience.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I think in my case I have this weird ambivalence because I had already achieved a certain expertise with JavaScript that I was more comfortable with that than I was in morphing that back into something, more statically and strongly typed, when it's like in the back of my brain, I know at the end of the day it's JavaScript that's running. And if I got to debug something, I got to understand what the JavaScript is doing, not what the TypeScript says. So I think that's another conceptual barrier for me, is sort of a fear that the debugging will actually get harder, because I'll be staring at the TypeScript saying, why is it doing this? And not realizing, what the actual JavaScript that's running is.
Yes, I can feel that too. That is a good point. I didn't even think of that. But JavaScript for a person just getting into it is hard enough to debug as it is, right? I mean, it is not easy like Visual Studio and C# and VB. It is actually fairly difficult to do. And browser tools and debugging tools have come a long way. But that being said, it's still not the easiest thing.
Right, and when I was using it, certainly there were a number of little times where I had some little syntactical error, and I was like, ooh, looky there, Squiggly's telling me I'm wrong, instead of waiting until I run and get the P is not defined 20 layers down in Angular. It's more, no, this, you're creating an object where you didn't even know you were creating an object if you were doing it in JavaScript. But in the TypeScript, it just goes, no, go no further until you get basic syntax.
Yep. Well, why don't you give us one little aspect, and I know you have a little demo to show us today. Why don't you tell us how you supply data to those screens? What do you use in the back end?
That's a good question. I know you mentioned Breeze earlier. I'm definitely a big Breeze fan. I did a whole Pluralsight course on it, and if I'm doing anything CRUD-ish, then my first instinct is to use Breeze to get the data into the client side. There's certainly, if you're integrating with some other person's web API, integrating with web APIs that are not inherently CRUD themselves, then it's basically going to be just AJAX calls, typically using Angular. Angular's got its own HTTP service that's an alternative to using jQuery AJAX. So if you're doing Angular, you tend to do it end-to-end. But sometimes it's just a raw AJAX call with HTTP service of Angular. But most of the time, if it's data, I'm going to be kind of pushing and pulling that using Breeze.
Okay, I'll have some Breeze questions for you after this.
Sure.
I want to see what your thoughts are as well. But why don't you go ahead and give the demo and let us see what this is all about.
Demo time! Right. Yeah.
So let me get sharing going here.
Oh, there's the F14.
All right, so what I've got here is just it's a fairly simple little app that I use in some of the workshops I do on single-page apps. I'll go ahead and run it here real quick. See if I can get it on the right screen. Trying here. Sorry, my mouse is spazzing. Come on, mouse. There we go. So fairly simple, CRUD-oriented app here. Got some, customer listing with some beautifully, great user experience GUIDs in the user space, exactly what you want to do, not. And you can go and edit a customer, get an editing experience with some validation tied in there, just kind of typical CRUD type of stuff you want to do, and you can go place an order. And notice the kind of navigation here is, kind of a key part of what differentiates a SPA, is you kind of have to watch closely. But if you watch the address bar and the tab for a spinning arrow, you're navigating around here, you're switching views, you're jumping between things, and you're never leaving the client side. And so that's one of the key differentiators. Now the address bar is changing, but notice it's all off to the right of the hash there. So it's client side navigation, not posting back to the server side. And so there's just, some CRUD-oriented functionality here. And at the end of the day, we can put an order together, we can submit an order. And we've got some nice little pop-up toast there using John Papa's toaster library, and also the styling here for people who have seen some of John Papa's courses on Pluralsight there. I'm using his hot towel template to kind of give a little nicer look and feel to get started with things. So one of the key things that's kind of different here, if you're a traditional web developer, whether MVC or web forms, is that you go in here and you go, okay, where's my views folder? Now there happens to be a models folder there, but it's totally empty. So this was started as an MVC project when I first created it, but there is no real MVC rendering going on here. Now you don't have to do it this way, and we should kind of talk about the fact that you can certainly have a hybrid MVC and single page app, and that's actually often a very good way to go about it in terms of the top level structuring of the site as a whole. But just to kind of emphasize the SPA aspects here, this is just a single HTML page that has a bunch of HTML fragments, if you will, that are going to get loaded up into it. And so the root page itself doesn't do much other than pull in a bunch of scripts down here at the bottom. You can see it pulling in things like some various modules of Angular itself, pulling in Breeze, pulling in Bootstrap for some widgets, and so on. And then you start having a bunch of individual JavaScript files that compose the app. And so this is where I was talking earlier about patterns of separation and modularity and stuff that Angular leads you in the direction of doing. This is where that comes in, is that you are sort of forced to think in terms of kind of Legos and building blocks and saying, okay, I've got this chunk of the screen that's going to do this. I need some HTML for that. I need some JavaScript functionality that supports it, but that's totally separable from this other chunk of the screen over here. And these are patterns of separation that we've been doing for years in XAML on the client side, and now we're just applying similar things to the client side in HTML and JavaScript. So you start drilling down in the app, and if you're using Angular, it doesn't force you, but it leads you down the path of sort of centralizing everything under a single root folder. And you have this app.js, for example, is kind of conceptually like your main method in a .NET program. So it's really the entry point where Angular takes over and says, okay, run your app and start composing your app from the modular pieces that you've defined. So here we're just calling this app, kind of unimaginative here, but excuse me. But that could be, the name of a particular functional module that's part of your overall application. And once you get past that, then you start decomposing into individual views and controllers. So for example, the initial customers listing you saw there was really just this fragment where we're building up a table from raw HTML elements, but then we've got some data binding statements in here using Angular to pull in a collection of customers from our controller. And for people who have been exposed to MVVM, the way Angular does data binding and does these separation patterns, You can almost interchangeably say controller or view model, and they mean the same thing. The data binding mechanisms here in Angular are extremely similar to XAML data binding, and so it's almost closer to MVVM than it is to a traditional MVC architecture. But it's Angular, it's Google, and MVVM is kind of a Microsoft-specific term. So if you're a core Angular kind of guy, you talk about them purely in terms of controllers, not view models. So this just, I won't go into core details on data binding syntax and that kind of stuff, but all these double curly braces, and anytime you see an ng dash something, that's a Angular directive that's doing some dynamic population of something on the page for you. And generally, most of those are pointing to things that are exposed by your controller. So each view will have its controller. There's syntax of how you define these things, that you get into. And again, that's all very prescriptive, and you're led down the path of having good modular JavaScript, which is really, JavaScript is not object-oriented, so the closest you can get is having kind of good structure to the code so that things kind of sort of feel like well-defined encapsulated objects, and you do that by having really functions at the end of the day that encapsulate chunks of your code in an object-oriented sort of way, even though the low-level JavaScript is not object-oriented so much. So each view will have a controller, and you can see, for that pop-up edit view, that's just another fragment of HTML that happens to come up in a modal dialog, but it's got its own supporting controller that does the edit functionality. And then when we go over and start placing an order, there's a customer order page, or a fragment, if you will. And notice all these it's pretty much just divs inside divs inside divs is the way you define your views and have nested layers of these views put together with their own supporting controllers. But that's kind of the high-level experience. So, what does it feel like to define an Angular app? You think in terms of the top-level container for the app, and that's defined by your entry starting point here. And then you start thinking about the composite views that come together in the form of, these various views that I was pointing to that come together to form your whole UI. So does that make sense?
Totally. I'm all over this. I'm not interrupting you even a little bit. I'm just like, give it. Come on. This is great.
Now, the one other just, architectural thing I'd point out here is, it should be a good layered architecture on the client side as well. So, we were kind of joking earlier about just throwing a bunch of functions in a file and hoping it all works out. That besides just trying to have the different chunks of UI well encapsulated and have their own supporting controllers, you also want to think in terms of, should each one of those controllers be going out and making its own AJAX calls and pulling back data when there might be another part of the view that's going and getting that same data, manipulating that same data. So you have this whole kind of client stateful interaction with the data that you have to take into account. And so a good way to manage that is to put another layer underneath the controllers. So you kind of have your presentation layer as your HTML and CSS. You've got a UI logic layer as primarily your controllers. And then sitting underneath that, you typically have some client-side services. And this is really where Breeze can come into play. You don't have to use Breeze, as I said, but Breeze is a great way to go for your CRUD functionality. So you can see down here I've got this repository. So this would be a client-side repository that's encapsulating all my CRUD data access for a given portion of my overall application data model. And in this case, we're dealing with pizza data, so it's just one repository that lets me get customers down here, get products, create orders, order items, and so on. And you can see it just kind of breaks out as an API you expose from that client-side service that can be called by the individual controllers. And by doing that...
I was going to ask you how you did that. Yeah, but you just...
Yeah, so basically this just gets exposed and injected, and that's another, it's a very common pattern, but a lot of people haven't been exposed to dependency injection. That's one of the, maybe steeper learning curves about getting used to Angular is it's all about dependency injection, the way all these loosely coupled componentized parts come together at runtime. And so, in this case, we're defining this sort of shared service on the client side for reading, for reading and writing data. Let's see if I can get my mouse in control here.
Rogue mouse. It's a rogue mouse.
And it's got to be consumed by those controllers. So how do they get access to it? Well, they dependency inject it. So if we go up here, for example, to my customers controller, we can see up here, this customer's controller takes a dependency here on the ZA repository. So there's patterns to the dependency injection, slightly different syntax that you can use, different ways of declaring it. But here you can see that you define up here as you're declaring this controller and saying this is the controller called customers. You say it has a dependency on the HTTP service, and off the top of my head, I'm not sure why that's there because I'm not using it. You can see a commented out line of code, so that's why it's there. Once upon a time, this code was depending on it. But that's dead code, shame on me. It's depending on a location service from Angular that lets you get to things like query string parameters or URL parameters, or in this case, to navigate to another logical page within the app. Taking a dependency on common, this is part of that hot towel template I mentioned that this is built on top of from John Papa. So he's got some common functionality in there for logging, I think is the main thing. Oh no, I'm using a pattern he set up for activating your controllers when their data is ready. And then, one of those dependencies is the ZA repository itself. So you set up these layers of dependency, you inject those through the dependency mechanisms of Angular, and then each thing doesn't have to know explicitly about each other or how it comes into being or whether it's a singleton or not. It just says, give me one of these that has this API and I can use it. So that's kind of the high-level tour of what's it feel like to build an Angular app and what are some of the constructs you use. Obviously, there's a lot more to it. If you go down the list of all the things that Angular does, you've got filters and lots of other constructs that are part of Angular, transitions and animations, and directives are the biggest part of it. In the in the code I showed here, we're using pretty much all built-in directives, things like ng repeat here and ng click. But you can build your own custom control or custom directives as well. So directives become a point of encapsulation when you're doing Angular coding. So you can think of it as something you might have done as a user control in web forms. You could do as a custom Angular directive on the client side to encapsulate a chunk of HTML and supporting JavaScript that you can just drop on the page as a directive, for example.
Nice. So what do you find are what's some of the issues that occur from using Ajax, and some typical issues from like test case scenarios between JavaScript and Ajax? I just kind of wanted to throw that out there because somebody asked me that the other day.
So you're talking in terms of just testing the Ajax calls themselves? Yeah,
the test cases for like a site, for example.
I gotcha. So as I start building up a spa like this, a lot of it is focused on the calls going back and forth to the server. Right. So a first level of crude testing, certainly not repeatable, but more of a kind of debugging approach is to leverage Fiddler to the max, basically. You really can't do this stuff without using Fiddler or a tool like it. There's another nice in-browser Chrome extension called Postman that I also use. Postman's kind of like a scaled-down version of Fiddler that runs as a browser tab. Okay. And the nice thing about that is if you've got a site that's secured, you can go log in one tab and get your secure session going, and then fire up Postman in another tab, and you can look at those requests going back and forth because you're part of the same session by opening another tab, which you can't do with Fiddler. You have to go somehow log in by issuing raw requests from Fiddler. Mm-hmm. So there's that level of testing, which is really more debugging than testing, I would say. When it comes to the formal testing of the service calls, part of it is leveraging the dependency injection to say if you're talking unit tests, the service calls really shouldn't even be part of the unit tests. You should really be mocking out the layer that's doing the service calls and testing the layers of functionality above it with unit tests. And the dependency injection mechanisms of Angular really help out with that, because you can just use various mocking frameworks. There's a number of them out there. Jasmine is the most popular kind of end-to-end testing framework, and it's got a faking kind of capability to it as well that you can use. But basically, typical unit testing and mocking techniques of create a fake dummy, mock whatever term you want to use, substitute object, and inject that instead in the dependency injection mechanism instead of the thing that really makes the service calls.
Yeah, because I mean, like dealing with like data states and stuff like that sometimes, and then knowing kind of how to hit that on a per transaction basis, I guess you could say. That was what I was kind of dealing with.
Yeah, so on the other side of things, the service calls coming into the server where things like transactions will be going on, then that's more traditional unit testing frameworks, and you can use the HTTP client class, for example, in .NET to in a unit test framework such as Visual Studio or NUnit or something to just issue your raw requests that way and be able to write those in a way that's repeatable and automatable, if that's a word.
It is now. So I've got a quick Breeze question for you. So would you kind of describe, and I had to step away for a couple of seconds during the demo, unfortunately, and I apologize for that, but utilizing Breeze and the way that it works on the client side, do you think that that's a good good basis and functionality to do, say, offline saving of data during disconnected sessions?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're thinking of, you've got some functionality that, excuse me, depends on some data you're going to pull back via AJAX calls. You're going to work with that data in the screens of your app to some degree, but then, like you said, you want to go offline. Breeze makes it very easy in that anything it pulls back, it puts into a cache in memory. You can always query that cache locally. So if you're, especially if you've got multiple views that are all going to depend on some lookup lists, for example, go pull them down once as the app is starting up, and then just query against that local cache to populate things as you build up the pages and navigate around. But then when you go offline, it's very easy to reach into Breeze and go to, it's got a class called an entity manager that's kind of the wrapper around that cache. And you can just tell it to export all or part of that cache data. So you can basically run a query to tell it what portion of the cache data you want to pull out. And you can pull it out really just as a big JSON string at the end of the day. And that means it's very easy to just slam it down into local storage or session storage so that you can go offline. And then when you put a little chunk of script in the startup of your page that says, okay, go out to the cache or go out to local storage, for example, see if I've got data there, and if so, push it into the entity manager cache to kind of prime it so that it's right back there when you start back up. Okay. So it's very easy to kind of push and pull things that way by using the export-import functionality of the Breeze entity manager.
Cool. So that makes it sound like it'd be very easy to build something that would just go offline automatically and then come back on, and you could just say on your next save or something like that, say, hey, you have 6 records that were updated that weren't, and just push them on the next push, right?
Yeah. Exactly. You generally, to fully support that, for example, the most common scenario is they want to protect that if you've got a 20-field, data entry form, and the user fills out 19 fields and then clicks the big red X in the corner, you don't want them to lose their data. That does, excuse me, it does require you to kind of proactively save that data as you're going, because there's there's no chance at that point where they click the red X or close the tab, your code has no longer any opportunity to run. So it means that kind of field by field as things are changing, you generally can just, and it's pretty cheap operation too, to just reach into the entity manager and say, give me what you got now, give me it now, give me it now, and just keep slamming it down into to local storage, and then basically the last thing they entered is already there when you go to start back up.
Cool. One last spot question here, because this is one of the things that is kind of my passion in a lot of the demos that I give, especially for web pages, is I came out kind of probably like you did, out of the era of thick desktop client apps that had record sets and loaded hundreds of megs of data and yada 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 and function locally and then sent stuff. And I know that a lot of our clients want that. One of my things with the SPA app is that you can actually make that happen, right? And you can actually make it work pretty seamlessly and fairly fast, depending on what you're showing, of course. But it also allows that ability to carry your iPad, out of Wi-Fi range, still make some edits, and then come back in and just save it. So
Right.
I think that's a fairly rich data application. I think that's the new version of the rich data application.
And I think there's other forces there that are one of the reasons that using this architecture is good, is that if you're willing to tolerate the user experience that results, and I kind of say that jadedly, you can use something like Cordova or PhoneGap to take your spa and turn it into a packaged mobile app that goes into a store. Because if you use Cordova, you're basically building a spa. It starts with a root index HTML page, and what you do from there down is up to you. And if you build it all out, as a web app with Angular and doing all this stuff, it's 100% conducive, assuming you use something like Bootstrap as a responsive design framework, and assuming that you're okay with the fact that a drop-down list is not going to look like a native drop-down list unless you do something else, such as maybe use Telerik's Kendo UI framework that automatically adapts to what platform you're on. So that's why, my kind of jaded comment about the user experience is,
Yes.
Hands down, if you're a mobile developer and you want to ensure the best user experience, then you got to be native in some form, and that could include Xamarin.
No, I totally agree with you on that wholeheartedly. Using PhoneGap, you can get the things done, but they're not exactly native, right? When you go to Xamarin, you actually get a screen that looks like it was built by the phone maker itself. Yeah,
and I think in a lot of cases, it's PhoneGap Cordova is a great path for example, I'm working with one customer right now where they're just getting into this arena. They've had a fat client installed on the desktop in the enterprise for years and years, and suddenly they have these forces, hey, could you take this use case and put it on a mobile device for us? And they don't even know if people are going to use it. So, going in and investing at that point in, spinning up their team to do native development on all the different platforms just to get this use case out there and start seeing if there's any traction for it. That's a big proposition. But since they're already going to be building some of that same functionality as a web app, taking them down the path of saying, hey, build it as a spa for the browser, then you can wrap it with Cordova and put it on a mobile device and see if people like it or see what they want to actually have on the device, and then go build it native if you need to. So, really using it as the original PhoneGap name intended, as a gap filler to kind of get you into the mobile space, to get you into the development and start experiencing things there, I think is a good way to go. If you've got a well-defined set of requirements and you want to get the maximum user experience on every platform, no, I would never recommend you go PhoneGap as your first route. But there's an awful lot of people kind of moving functionality into mobile apps where the user experience doesn't have to be that special. They're just trying to get some data out there with broader reach than it had before. Get a little bit of functionality out there and start figuring out what makes sense for them to put on the mobile device so that they can then go invest and build it right. And I think that's why you see, news stories out there of people who have gone down the hybrid HTML route, but now they're rebuilding in native. Yep. Is because they get to that point where it's like, okay, we know really well what we want on the mobile platform now, and now it's time to optimize it for the user experience.
Very, very good point there. Yep. I want to touch one last thing in the SPA arena, just because I totally forgot, so I lied. There is one more question. So what is your belief on the multi-SPA type of application or hybrid application?
Yeah, so this is definitely something that I talk about a lot in my workshops, and I know we talked a little bit before the show. We share a similar perspective there, and Miguel, who was on your first show, he and I talk all the time, and he just finished up a great course on Pluralsight where he covers some of this as well. And I definitely see it as you don't go take some existing 400-page MVC or web forms app and rewrite it as a single root SPA. You just don't. Now, there are sometimes scenarios where someone is migrating a smart client. I had one customer I worked with where they were being forced by their customers. Basically, it sounds weird, but their customers, for various reasons, were saying, take this exact same functionality you had as a desktop application and give it to us in a browser. and have the user experience be as close to what we were used to as possible. If you go down that path, then doing it as a single root page and never leaving the client side and doing nothing but service calls once the app loads up might be the right path. It's going to be a tricky path to get there, but in general, I think that most web applications, I think the confusion is around the term single page application. Web developers think of the application boundaries being their entire site. And a single page application to me, it's kind of like the reversal of, in the SOA days, we had SOA as the magical term that, the magical unicorn everyone had to pursue. And the problem was no one could really define well what the A architecture part of that really meant. They could define how to use service technologies and certain tenets about what your service boundaries should look like and things like that. But they couldn't really say, what does a SOA look like if A means architecture? But they could say, what does a SOA look like if A means application? Yes. Now it's kind of the opposite with SPAs. SPAs is really more of an architecture for building out a page. So it's really more single page architecture in my mind, not single page application. It's that you are building out a chunk of functionality within your overall site, or in the web developer's mind, the application is the site boundaries. So you're building out a chunk of functionality using SPA techniques as a way to structure that page. And usually you do that because that page has some stuff going on, meaning there's some ongoing interactivity, some data manipulation, some navigation that all ties together a cohesive use case for a user. And this is really how I approach it in design as well, is give me a good use case definition where there's a sequence of things that a user goes through that are all sort of functionally or data model related. And that gives me a rough idea of a boundary I might draw to say this should be a SPA. And then right over here, here's a separate use case, same site, same application to the end user, but it's a separate use case. And it doesn't share any of the same data, and it doesn't, they don't navigate back and forth between those two constantly to get a single task done. It's the same kind of mentality I've had in designing composite UI applications in the XAML space. If you think about something like Outlook, yeah, there may be links between calendar and inbox, but functionally they're mostly different. And so those would be two, if I was building out Outlook as a SPA, I would build a SPA that is the inbox, and I would build a SPA that is the calendar. I would not build a SPA that is Outlook. So I would have a site that is Outlook, and I would have a composition of a number of SPAs within it that give me the overall functionality, and then just use linking between them to provide those seams where the junctions are between them.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, JJ.
No. I said yes, sir. Wholeheartedly agree. Still part of the conversation. I haven't gone anywhere.
Well, Brian, I've got one last question for you, and then I'm going to turn you over to JJ for the remainder. But we've talked about a lot of things. You were, flying in jets. You started in computers and coding and whatnot, doing gaming and whatnot. But what do you do away from the computer? Do you have any hobbies or passions?
Mostly these days, it's spending time with my son. I've got a 9-year-old son, and so just trying to get out and do active things with him. I like. I've never been a traditional sports guy. I grew up surfing. I grew up in Southern California, and was just a hardcore surfer all through from 7 years old until I graduated high school and went off to the Naval Academy. Mm-hmm. And so there was actually a culture there that surfers hated jocks. So I had kind of an inherent bias from an early age of basketball, football, baseball, traditional sports. That's not for me. But activities-wise, I've always enjoyed active things and getting out there. So as I went from surfing and moved inland, then it became skiing and mountain biking. I also did bicycle motocross growing up. So mountain biking's always been something I love. Kayaking, just getting out there and doing stuff, basically. No one thing. I don't have, a pet rock collection or, a Civil War reenactment costume that I put on or any of those kinds of things. There's a lot of that in this area.
There is.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool.
Coming to us from Virginia. That's saying a lot. It's just saying a lot. Don't they have like a reenactment like every weekend or something?
Yeah, just about, especially here where I live in Old Town Alexandria. Yeah, it seems like every weekend there's guys walking down the street in colonial outfits.
Right on. That's all I gotta say to that. I'm not trying not to be smart about it. I'm just saying, teach their own.
Very true.
Yep. But so where can our audience find more about you and what you're doing on Twitter? Where you're more active, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm kind of surgy in my activity there, but yeah, on Twitter I'm just at Brian Noyes. Noyes spelled like no yes.
No,
and
yes.
I do have a blog at.
I just got it. I literally just saw that.
Well, actually, in aviation we always have call signs, and one of the call signs I went through was maybe. Or no, yes, maybe.
Awesome.
But yeah, so Brian Noyes on Twitter and briannoyes.net as a site for my blog. Although I'm a sporadic blogger as well, I'll get to one of those points where I'm like, I got to blog more, and I'll get 3 or 4 posts out, and then 3 months will go by, and it's like, oh yeah.
I mean,
I'm glad I'm not the only one. I really am.
I mean, you get into that. I spent some time on our own on STLTechTalk.com today. I was spending some time doing stuff like that, and then I looked up and I'm like, oh man, it's one of those things, man. You put your head to the grind, you put your nose to the grindstone or whatever. The next thing you know, you busted out a whole bunch of stuff, and man, time flies, and it's hard to commit to that sometimes for sure. So that is your first and last name .net. That's your website. And what we do, Brian, is we ask our guests to pick out a question out of a handful of questions, and you picked, how do you see technology changing within the next 3 to 5 years? That's what you highlighted, so let's talk a little bit about that.
And I'll immediately caveat the way I'm going to answer that. So I looked at those questions and went, okay, I'm not freaking Nostradamus here. I never claimed to have a crystal ball or know where the you're a surfer and you were in California. Come on, you can't tell me you didn't shroom it up a little bit at one point. You can't. We're friends here. We're not. We won't tell anyone. Promise. No, there was never any of that.
Right.
So my caveat is I can't say what's going to happen, but I can certainly say what I hope happens. Mm-hmm. And to me, that is that the seams between our technology devices become more seamless. Okay. I'm a guy who bounces around. I've got an iPad, a Surface Pro, a Nokia 2520, an iPhone. I still am a holdout and haven't jumped the Windows Phone boat yet. I jumped from my Windows desktop machine to my MacBook Pro into Windows VM, and so I've got lots of these seams in my life, and much to the chagrin of most of the things I do professionally or Microsoft, I have to say Apple's got it best here. The seamlessness as I move from my MacBook Pro to my iPad to my iPhone to my Apple TV is awesome. It's not flawless, but it's much closer to what I would hope the future would hold for all our devices, regardless of what platform they are. So, one would be for Microsoft to, and they are definitely constantly improving on this, but
it seems like they're trying. It seems like they're trying really hard.
Yeah. So getting the seams and the app experience on desktop, tablet, and phones and Xbox. The Xbox is actually probably the best part of it these days. But also, I'd love to see, this may never happen just simply because of the competitive forces that are in opposition to it, but having more seamlessness across platforms. So, making it so I don't have to go, okay, if I'm on my Windows devices, I got to use this app with its own, back-end data store. But if I go over to this other device on an Apple device, then I got to use a different app with its own data store, and I got to move data around. There's not a seamless experience there.
Definitely, yep.
So do you think, not to take too much more time, but do you think that because privacy concerns, that keeps us from really, and I'm not, I'm more of, I lean, obviously I have a Windows phone, my primary driver, I have a Surface Pro that I use, and I'm huge in this ecosystem, but I am kind of spread all over the place because of what we do here. But do you think that it's privacy concern? Do you think that, okay, if one was to completely do away with privacy and we'll just shelf that for a minute, then we would have more apps communicating with each other because they'd be able to pull so much more data, but we're just not there. We're not willing to share that kind of information with the world.
No, I don't know. I mean, certainly, privacy is becoming a bigger and bigger deal these days. Just if not just for better visibility on what the challenges and the things you need to address are. I don't see that so much as a limiting factor. I think it's really more just the practical reality that if you're an app developer that's got to write a front end and a back end, you can't focus on all platforms at once. So you're going to go to one of the two major platforms first, probably, right, and get that all working best, and then probably go to the other major platform first. And third place is always going to be lingering, and you'll have a certain ecosystem. I think this is unfortunately where the Windows Phone and Windows 8 App Store development is now, is that there's certainly, there's all us tried and true, diehard Microsoft people. They're like, damn it, I want this platform to succeed, so I'm going to do my part, and I'm going to get an app out there that does something meaningful. And so there's going to be apps there, but they're not going to be the same apps, and they're not going to have the same back end because they were, built independently from those major vendors. So I think that's where my frustration comes in, and actually I think the more frustrating is when those major vendors put an app on there, but it's a crappy experience compared to the other platforms, and they just let it sit there and linger. And you see even just like Amazon Kindle is a good example. When I read on my Windows devices, I can't change the font. I can change the color of the background, but I can't even change the font. Whereas on any of the other devices, Amazon has an app, or Kindle has an app on, you can change the font. So it's just little things like that mount up that become frustrating, and I would like to have less of that.
Well, we had, so let me clarify a little bit on what I asked. So we had Daniel Gary on last night. He's a developer for Windows Phone primarily, and Windows in general primarily, and all that kind of stuff. And he was talking about how Windows Phone's APIs for the notification center is still not open for everybody. You have to be like a big time developer to get those kinds of notifications and stuff. And the reason why I brought up privacy is and with Google and stuff, with their watch now, with their phone, with their Chrome TV, with their tablets, with all that stuff, and the Google Now cards, and how everything follows you everywhere, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, if you were a developer and you didn't have to worry about asking permission, and you could just go in, whether large or small, and create this awesome experience, because you were talking about how Apple almost has it right? Like, you go from one thing to another to another to another, and it's all just pretty okay. I think that's why I brought up the privacy thing, because I think that if there was access to all of those things, there could be algorithms that could sort through what you care about, what you don't, and all those other kinds of stuff, and your use cases and all that, and then be able to share all your content, and like how Apple has AirPlay and all that kind of stuff.
I gotcha.
That's where I was going with that. I think.
I can definitely see. That certainly, if you could bring down all those barriers and have it not be the end of the world for all of us in terms of. Certainly that would improve things. And like you mentioned, you do see that, especially on the Google side, because I think they take that to the nth degree of anything that touches anything of theirs, they feel free to use in any way they see fit.
And they make no apologies for that. Like, they just straight up said, "This is how we operate."
Exactly.
Sorry.
Yeah, so it still always creeps me out. The other day, I ordered a shirt from Jase Bank, or however you say that clothing company.
Yeah.
It wasn't 5 minutes later, I fired up, a different browser instance, and I was on some site, and a sidebar.
You saw an ad. You saw an ad, didn't you?
The shirts that I had just ordered was what it was rendering in their ad.
Wow.
Literally, I mean, I bought 3 shirts, and those were the 3 shirts they showed, and it was just like, okay, that's just creeping me out, man.
I did that too. I was just like, man, this is nuts. I was like, because we were doing camera equipment, and the next thing you know, we got something from B&H. I don't know if you're familiar with that, and then this was a couple days later. That was all I saw. That was all I saw was from that, and I was like, stop following me.
Exactly.
It's like a creeper, at this point, down on 3rd and Main. So we have announcements coming up, and obviously we want you to talk about your plugs for your Pluralsight courses and stuff. But Gus, why don't you go ahead and tell people what's coming up for you and us?
Sure.
Yeah, us and me. Well, upcoming shows, Phil Japitsky is going to be on in a couple of weeks. Next week is a little up in the air. I will have it probably posted by the weekend. But Phil will come on and talk about some really cool stuff. He's an ex-Telerik evangelist, and Microsoft MVP, enterprise architect, great guy. Should be fun to talk to. Also, co-host of Hallway Conversations. However, for me, Dev Connections is coming up next month, September 15th through the 19th in Las Vegas. Can't wait for that. It's going to be a great time. Come out and see some great speakers. And if you see me there and you watch the show, come up and say hi. JJ, what do you have?
JJ has Strange Loop that's coming up. Obviously, St. Louis Days of .NET's a big deal. And people, I am teaching classes on this Saturday and next Saturday still, so there's still time to sign up. Go to our site, and it's our August Business Workshop Speaker Series. Well, I call it the Business Workshop Series, but whatever. And go and sign up if you're in the St. Louis area for sure. Otherwise, we have some big name guests coming up on our STLTechTalk podcast. We're very excited about. Also, I wanted to let everybody know about charities that I think you should all be a part of. Hope Line, it's a domestic violence prevention program. The Women's Safe House, Safe Connections, the Schumann Water, and Hope for Young Adults with Cancer. I want everybody to go to our site, go to this web page's show notes, and all of that will be in there. Because I'm really big on charities, and I really think that people should do more to give back to their communities and help. So I think this is a good way for me to help facilitate that. So also, Strange Loop is going to be a lot of fun, and that's coming up. So we're very excited about that. Kevin and I will definitely be a part of that. Hopefully, Gus, we're trying to make that work, obviously, still. To get you in. But yeah, very, very exciting stuff, and that's what I have to talk about. So with that, Gus, what's your final thoughts on the end of this wonderful show, sir?
I think Brian was fantastic. However, I want Brian to plug some stuff before I continue.
Sure.
Cheers, Brian.
Yeah, I guess the main plug would be my Pluralsight courses. I've got 7 in the library there and an eighth one on the way. Stuff ranging from XAML topics such as WPF data binding and Windows Store apps to Breeze, as I mentioned. I've got a whole course on Breeze that we talked about tonight. Just put one out there that's a WCF jumpstart and so on. So just go out to pluralsight.com and certainly check out all the other ones there too. I'm as much a consumer of Pluralsight as I am an author. So check out the great content there. And show-wise, I'm going to be at several conferences coming up. I'll be at VS Live in Redmond next week, DC in October, and Orlando in December, or is it November? Somewhere out there. And also Dev Intersections in Las Vegas.
Awesome. So anybody that sees him on here, please walk up to him and tell him, hey, we saw you on CodeCast, and you were great.
Yeah, absolutely.
And let's talk spa.
That would be awesome. Everyone totally do that. Yes,
definitely. But for me to finish off the show, I think the show was great. Brian, you were an excellent guest. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about something that actually I have touched and have had to deal with recently. And you actually answered some questions for me, and I hope our audience feels the same way.
Great. Glad to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you. Anytime.
Yeah, no, it was wonderful, and I look forward to having you back if your time allows, obviously, because I'll bother you to death until you come back. To talk with you. Again, thank you, Brian, for being on. We can't thank you enough. So thank you so much. Thank you, Gus, for everything that you do, and thank you to all of our fans. We love and thank you for your support of the show. So from the entire STL Tech Talk crew, good coding. We're out.